Because if Sri Lanka, again, is receiving investment from any country for a carbon trading project here, it should be towards something called high-hanging fruits. So projects that are more costly to implement, and whatever is cost-effective to implement, let the government of Sri Lanka do that themselves. But everything else, because it's foreign investment, let it go towards projects that are more costly to do.
Effective policies and regulatory frameworks are essential for driving decarbonization. Which policies have you seen work well in other countries? And what actions would you recommend for Sri Lanka to create an enabling environment for decarbonization?
So the type of policy I would say has really worked are policies that would get companies or would have companies meet a mandatory requirement to reduce their emissions. So this is something that we call a compliance market trading. So right now, majority of trading occurs in the voluntary market. So you as a company might buy carbon credits because you want to voluntarily meet your own sustainability goals, to meet your own voluntary net zero targets again. But this compliance market is slightly different, where the government or regional body might say, for this particular industry or this type of company, you must meet a certain emissions level. To take Singapore as an example, there's currently a policy in place where any company that emits above 20,000 metric tons per year has to pay a carbon tax of $25 now, but this will scale up to $50 to $80 a ton. So if you were to emit 21,000 tons, you had to pay that difference of 1,000 tons into $25. So to overcome that, companies can instead buy carbon credits. Similarly, in Japan, in Tokyo, they have a domestic ETS system that would get companies to purchase credits. The largest and most popular example is the European Union. They have the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme, where there's an annual reduction in the total emissions the EU can emit as a whole. So this decreases by around 1.5 to 2% each year. So what this means is that there is less CO2 emissions to go around. So as a company, you have to reduce your CO2 emissions. If you don't, you have to purchase carbon credits. And in the EU, it's about 100 euros per ton. So it's very expensive. So what this does is that it creates a financial incentive for companies to decarbonize their own operations rather than purchase carbon credits. The other use of carbon credits would be to abate unavoidable or unabatable emissions. So let's say one company has implemented as many policies as they could to reduce their own emissions. There's always a small percentage of emissions that they cannot get rid of. It might be through utilities, it might be through transportation, it might be because of the nature of their operation, because it's a mining company. So for these companies, there's always going to be some level of emissions they cannot get rid of, so they have to purchase carbon credits as a result. So I think these mandatory requirements create not just a strong incentive, but a requirement to reduce emissions. Now that's the West. I would say in Sri Lanka, we don't really need a similar mandatory requirement to reduce emissions because Sri Lanka does not have an emissions problem, right? Our per capita GHG emissions is about 0.8 tons per individual per year. And even nationally, we emit less than 1% of global emissions. So it's not the case that Sri Lanka has, uncontrollable greenhouse gas emissions and we must do something now. I'm still in favor of, reducing emissions, but on the global perspective, we as the government or as companies may not need to purchase carbon credits the same way that companies in the EU are purchasing credits. I think for us, it's really a matter of how do we get our companies here in Sri Lanka to work with companies elsewhere that have a mandatory requirement. So connecting companies domestically and internationally so that Sri Lankan companies can win, so that the government of Sri Lanka can win as well. I think policies that would make sense here would be mostly energy efficiency projects. So in our current industrial processes, how do we reduce CO2 emissions through efficiency improvements, or how do we, let's say, remove plastic, again, going back to plastic credits, rather than saying, okay, this company X has emitted 10 tons over the cap, let's introduce a carbon tax. I think a carbon tax is definitely not something Sri Lanka should do, and it's not being considered as well. But that is how policies differ between the global south countries and developed countries. For Sri Lanka, I would also say it is how do we get our companies to engage in sustainable finance mechanisms, right? So again, going back to the green bond example from the CSE, you're much more likely to have weight behind the bond or confidence behind the bond if it was issued by another institution like the World Bank. Let's say that I spoke of the outcome-based bond. If the World Bank was to issue a bond and to have the project implemented here. So I would say it's that awareness raising and capacity building that we need to do here as well. I would also preface that and say there's only so much capacity and so much awareness building you can do until you realize you've done nothing at all. So in a policy angle, I would say Sri Lanka should really identify itself as a net exporter of carbon credits and net exporter of these other trading mechanisms. But also a question of how do we as a country mitigate potential financial impediments of projects or policies done elsewhere. One example is in the European Union, they have something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What this is that the EU will identify the carbon content embedded in all of the goods exported to the EU. So let's take steel as an example. They would determine the carbon content of that steel, and the buyer or the exporter would have to purchase carbon credits to account for that. But carbon credits in the EU, not carbon credits in a different market. So again, remember this was 100 euros per ton. So for a Sri Lankan firm exporting potential high carbon products to the EU, there is going to be a financial, let's say, tax that will come in place in 2026. So I would say it's also identifying what other governments are doing and how do we, as a country, make sure that we're so competitive in our exports. How are we competitive in the projects that we can implement here? So these are some of the policy angles that I would recommend, the government and companies here to look at.
Community involvement is the key part of any climate-related plan. How important is local community engagement in driving decarbonization, particularly in both rural and urban communities?
So Sri Lanka has one of the lowest urbanization rates in the world. I think it stands at around 17-18%. That means the rest live in rural areas of the country. So any project that requires to have scale, that requires to have considerable international investment come in, would almost certainly require the participation of the rural community in Sri Lanka. To give you an example, I was speaking about the agriculture project that Serendib Assets is developing in the rice cultivation field. There are 2 million farm families in Sri Lanka. So any project in that space would have to require the participation of these farmers on the ground, right? So it's a question of how do you build trust with these farmers, and the question of how do you make sure that the project will deliver the social and environmental benefits it says it will deliver. Because if it doesn't work out, you're going to upset a large majority of individuals here. So that's one, on the responsibility side. I think two, in terms of just any successful project, you do need the active involvement of the local community. Because what happens is if you try to implement a blanket project somewhere and it does not work for the local community, what would happen is that there's no incentive for the people living in the surrounding area to either protect or take care of the project that has been done, and you're going to have either a lot of financial expenditure trying to maintain that without the local participation, or the project simply will not work after 2-3 years. And this has happened in many instances in several countries. And I think without the participation of the local community, nothing will really happen. Another segment of the population that we're targeting is women. Right now, approximately 65 to 70% of women in Sri Lanka are deemed economically inactive. And this is from our census. This is the terminology that is used. And I think, with the recent change in administration, with the recent, the way that the financial markets are going, I think we'll see a lot of women enter the workforce as well. And they're primarily living in these rural areas. So the question is, how would a potential project reach out to these women who want to join the formal sector, want to join the workforce, or at least be part of these projects that we're discussing? So I think without their active participation, you don't have a project to begin with.
What strategies have been effective in fostering collaboration between government, private, and also in civil societies? How can Sri Lanka strengthen these partnerships and to advance climate goals?
So one strategy that I've seen work really well is something called a participatory approach to developing these projects. So again, on the example of farmers, it's not the case that we just go out to the field and tell the farmers to do A, B, C, D. They're not going to do it. You need to sit down with them, have a proper consultation, listen to what their concerns are, listen to what they think needs to happen, listen to what has happened for the past 5 years or so to understand their perspective, and then build a project based around their requirements and based around what their needs are at the moment. Without that, you're not going to have, again, a successful project. So I would say this participatory approach is something that's very key. It's been done in several countries, not just on the environmental side, but even on the public administration, financing side, it's been done. In Brazil, they have a policy of participatory budgeting. In some of their rural or municipal councils, we have this approach where individuals from the community would come and talk about where they think money needs to go towards. So very similarly for environmental projects, especially between, let's say, the developer and the local community, you would need to have this participatory stakeholder consultation type approach. When it comes to the government, I would say between the developer and the government, it is a question of demonstrating the financial and environmental benefits of this project, being transparent about how you're implementing this project, and how it would meet the goals of the government, right? So with each project that we do, we work with a government department, a government agency, or one of the line ministries. So we make sure that this would meet the NDC targets of the country. This would meet the strategic objectives of the ministry that we're dealing with. Because again, without that, there's no incentive for the ministry to give their support or their resources even for us to implement this project. So I think by effectively managing these two groups, you also build confidence with the investor, right? So this is something when I spoke earlier about building that conducive investment environment. This is something all the investors ask. Do you have the approval of government? Do you have the approval of the grassroots level community that you're working with? Because once you have this in place, people are more likely to trust you and more likely to give you money to implement this project. So this is one approach that I see that has worked in developing these projects.
Looking to the future, what emerging trends in decarbonizations do you think will have biggest impact globally? And how can Sri Lanka position itself to benefit from these trends?
So these trends, I would say, are what I briefly touched on earlier about the mandatory requirements. So you're seeing central banks, you're seeing stock exchanges globally set mandatory reporting requirements. So I think this is something that will really sweep through all governments, all jurisdictions, and it's something that will come to Sri Lanka as well. When it comes to this reporting angle for companies, there is a lot of harmonization work that's taking place to harmonize and standardize the type of reporting that companies ought to do. So for example, I mentioned the the financial sector and this aspect of financed emissions. So there is a lot more clarity now in the market about what type of data to report and how to report it, who to report it whom to report it to. So that's one trend that I see that is coming. I think Sri Lanka, we will need to, again, work with companies to make sure that any mandatory requirement that is in place, whether it's for public companies or otherwise, includes the active participation of these companies in these discussions. Otherwise, what will happen is you just implement a policy without any input from who is going to be on the receiving end of this policy, and it might not be a smooth transition. So that's one element. I think other trends are also developing a robust and a interdisciplinary project. So again, with an environmental project, if it's carbon credits in the agricultural space, it's not enough just to reduce CO2 emissions or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You also need to have a strong social component, a strong biodiversity component as well, so that you have a story to tell, right? So that your investor would want to come here and not just purchase the carbon credits, but also they have impacted lives on the ground, that impacted or improved the ecological system of the country. One topic that we're really looking to mitigate in terms of biodiversity is human-elephant conflict in Sri Lanka. Right now, at the rate that elephants are dying, they're expected to go extinct in 7 years. And this is a national treasure, a national animal for the country. And what the previous government has done, it was to give guns to farmers to shoot any wildlife, not elephants specifically, but any wildlife that would encroach on their crop land. So the trend that I'm seeing right now is specifically social labels and biodiversity labels on carbon crediting projects, so that investors know, okay, this project will not just do one thing, but there are 10 co-benefits from doing this as well. So that's some of the trends that I see that's coming up and will become very important in the times to come.
As we look ahead, what are your top recommendations for policymakers in Sri Lanka to effect to advance decarbonization?
So some recommendations or suggestions I could make to the government might be to take stock of the action done. So all of the strategies of each ministry to make sure that there's no competing projects, to make sure that each project meets our NDC. So for this, you would need a GHG inventory, for example, to participate in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. You would need a complete GHG inventory or profile of Sri Lanka, which is something we don't have at the moment. It's being developed. And also to make sure that the projects are, they build synergy between each other. So some sort of centralized system or office to really manage and direct and make sure that each ministry is doing what they say they will do. So that's one recommendation. I think a second recommendation would be to identify which instruments the government of Sri Lanka really wants to target. So again, carbon trading in Article 6 is only one instrument. There's many other financing tools that the government can use. Debt for nature swap is another one, outcome-based bonds is another one. So I think developing a coherent investment strategy for this, so that investors know what the government's position is on each of these types of tools, would be very helpful. Even for us as a developer, when we go out and enter into negotiations with the companies, there's a lot of guesswork that has to take place on what might the government say, what might the government do. But if all of these were laid out in terms of what the government's policy position would be, that would be very helpful. You can think of this very similar to what the EDB, the Export Development Board, does. Their job is to make sure that Sri Lankan exports are highlighted in the world, that they're competitive, that Sri Lanka has a conducive environment for attracting FDIs, attracting investment. So very similarly with the sustainable finance approach, you also need to make sure that there is someone responsible for ensuring that our financial terms for these projects are competitive. Because let's say what happened in some other countries was you might develop a project, a carbon trading project in a particular area, but then the government says, okay, all of these carbon credits I own now, right? And then the project just goes bust, it doesn't happen. So Sri Lanka needs to make very clear to investors what their line is. If the government wants to take 5% of the revenue, 10%, you would need to know that now. So that's another recommendation. I think 2 is to also, or 3 is to think outside the box, right? Again, I spoke about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. To come out of the current situation that we're in, to leverage our natural resources, and to really propel the economy towards a green economy, one that is utilizing nearly 100% renewable energy. The question is, how do we think differently and do differently to what we've done? How do we reduce our waste in the country? How do we improve circularity? Something that Sri Lanka also does is that all of the wastewater we dump into the ocean, right? In Vellavatte and somewhere north of Colombo. This can be used for energy. It's being done in Sweden, right? The production of biogas. Right now, a majority of Sweden's vehicles run on biogas produced. And what we're doing is we're just dumping money into the ocean, if you look at it in that perspective, right? And at the same time, we're polluting our ocean. When there's money to be made by keeping the ocean pristine because it reduces CO2 emissions, or it sequesters carbon, and it stores it in the deeper levels of the ocean. So that's another approach. So I would say to employ a change of mindset to realize where money can be made, right? Because you might think you can make $10 by cutting down a tree, but actually if you let the tree grow, I will give you $30, right? And that is the financial decisions or the that is the how would you say, the financial considerations that are there when it comes to looking at leveraging your nature, the natural assets. And I think a lot of the natural element is missing from our current policy decisions. So we think that cutting down the tree or polluting the ocean is the best course of action. So I would say also reassessing the way we decide what is finance and what is not, right? To include these environmental considerations, to include the environmental cost, to include the carbon cost of these projects. Right now in the US or in the Western world, a lot of companies have an internalized cost of carbon where they say, okay, for this action, we need to assume that we're going to have a carbon cost of $50. So given that $50 cost, does it now make sense to do this project? So I think it's this idea from the economic perspective of having an internalized cost of carbon, internalized environmental costs in our decision making, because there is a value that we need to place on these assets, environmental assets, that I believe we're currently not doing.
To wrap up, what key messages would you like to share with Sri Lankan individuals and organizations that aspire to contribute decarbonization efforts?
So I would say, taking a broader perspective, I would say Sri Lanka is in a very unique position now. We've been hit by crisis after crisis, and I think we're very resilient in that regard. We're still standing right now. But I would say, given this unique position, we need to make sure that we are making the most of what we have. Just to give a timeline context to this, we're not able to access traditional capital or traditional finance until 2027, 2028. Sri Lanka's closed the capital markets at the moment. So I think in these few years, in these 3-4 years, it's the question of, instead of going through traditional financial markets, what is it that we can do to not only meet our economic objectives, our financial objectives, but to also protect the environment and to conserve our resources at the same time. And I think both of these goals of the environment and of finance do not need to be mutually exclusive. I think there is strong, research and an argument to show that they can be decoupled, where it's not, one or the other. So I think that's something I would encourage every individual to think about is how do we go from our position now into a much stronger position in the years to come so that we avoid going back to where we were, right? I don't think anyone wants to relive that. I think one, again, and this is my personal belief, is that, when you go through so many troubles like this, or from what we have faced, I think there's also a lot of opportunity. In the past few years, a lot of Sri Lankans have left the country because they think there's no money to be made here, or they think it's too difficult of a job to do. While I understand that perspective, I think when things seem as dark as they are, or they might have been, I think that is when you have the prime opportunity to leapfrog and to try something new, right? Sustainable finance is one element. There's many other, depending on the field. For me personally, I came to Sri Lanka just after the financial crisis, towards the end of last year, early this year, when I never thought it's something that I wanted to do. But I was looking around the world for specifically this type of job that I'm doing right now, which is developing carbon projects. And I think it makes the most sense in Sri Lanka to do that because A, there's a policy gap. So we're currently advising the government on policy. There's a project pipeline gap. We're currently developing projects with various institutions and various companies. And there's also a lack of international awareness on what Sri Lanka can offer. Every time we go to conferences abroad, people are very intrigued by what Sri Lanka has. And I think that potential is not yet tapped into. Just to wrap up, I think I'm saying all that to say it's time for us to be innovative in the way that we think, in the way that we approach how we do things. I think we should not follow what other countries maybe in the neighborhood have done. We're very capable of taking a new approach that works for us. Because again, Sri Lanka, even though we're part of the regional neighborhood system, we're still very different from what other countries have gone through. And the Sri Lankan story is also not entirely unique, where other countries, have gone through defaults, have gone through crises. What is unique to us is how fast we've recovered in the past 2.5 years. And I think we have a strong potential to be, the Costa Rica of South Asia, where they have managed to regrow their forests, conserve their environment, while still being a thriving country. So I think we should not consider these objectives as being, this or that, being mutually exclusive. But I think it is time for us to realize where our value lies, and how we can really leverage that and protect this island that we have, and how we can also improve livelihoods, take care of our wildlife and our biodiversity at the same time. So I think this is the approach that I would strongly consider or urge individuals and companies here and the government as well to view in that lens. And I think we can really make Sri Lanka a strong case study, a strong example to the world of what is possible and do something that has not been done before. And I would not be here personally in Sri Lanka if I don't think that was not possible. I think we're there. We have the right people in the right places. We have, policies that are coming up. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together. So I'm very hopeful, very optimistic of what Sri Lanka's future is, especially in these coming years while we're still in limbo, right, with the IMF, with all of these changes that's going on. I think opportunity is fantastic, and very excited to see what happens here.
Thank you, Don, for sharing valuable insight today. Actually, it is clear that decarbonization is not just environmental strategy, but is a strong tool that which can empower communities and inspire people to take more action. And I think this is actually a shared responsibility which all of us are part of it, and it is starting from a business to individual to policymaker. I think everyone has to do some sort of a role, working together to drive action and build sustainable future. Thank you for joining us today.
And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.